The morning mist rolled over the sprawling tobacco fields of Ashwood Manor, wrapping the Virginia estate in a ghostly veil. The world stirred slowly beneath the soft gold light of dawn, and from the upper balcony of the mansion, Miss Caroline Waverley, the 22-year-old heiress, stood poised like a painted figure lost in thought. The manor behind her was vast, its white columns towering like sentinels of pride and secrecy. Beneath that surface grace, the land pulsed with whispered stories of wealth built on broken backs, of sins that no sermon could cleanse. Below the balcony, rows of enslaved men and women moved like a dark tide across the fields. Their breaths merged with the morning fog, the rhythmic thud of hoes echoing through the valley. The air was heavy with the scent of damp soil, sweat, and something unspoken, a tension that had no name but was felt by every soul bound to Ashwood. Among them worked Josiah, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose quiet defiance had earned both punishment and respect. His eyes, sharp as flint, rose briefly toward the mansion, not in longing, but in a silent acknowledgement of the woman watching from above. Caroline's gaze lingered on him longer than it should have. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more, but deep down, she knew there was something about him that defied the boundaries her world had built for her. Josiah's movements were deliberate, controlled, almost regal despite the chains of his station. When he lifted his head and their eyes met, a strange heat coursed through her, swift as lightning and just as dangerous. She turned away quickly, clutching her shawl tighter, as if to hide her own trembling. Inside the house, the walls carried the scent of polished oak and lavender water. Mrs. Eleanor Waverley, Caroline's mother, ruled the household with a gentility so rigid it felt like marble. A lady's worth, she often said, is measured by her obedience to God, to family, to propriety. But even she could not still the restlessness in her daughter's spirit. Caroline had been raised to embody refinement, yet she found herself suffocating in it. Her father's death had left her the sole heiress, but also the sole prisoner of expectation. By midday, the estate hummed with the rhythm of work. In the kitchen yard, women stirred pots of cornmeal while children gathered kindling under the watchful eye of the overseer. Mr. Hollis, a man whose cruelty was as common as his shadow. Hollis rode through the fields, whip coiled at his side, his smirk curling whenever Josiah defied an order or met his gaze without fear. To Hollis, Josiah was troubled, too intelligent, too proud, but to Caroline that same intelligence made him unforgettable. That afternoon a storm brewed beyond the hills. Caroline, restless, wandered toward the stables. The air grew thick with humidity, and the sky darkened to the color of tarnished silver. She paused when she saw Josiah there, repairing a broken fence, shirt damp with sweat, muscles rippling with effort. The sight of him struck her breathless, though she dared not let it show. "You shouldn't be out here, miss," Josiah said softly without turning. His voice was deep, carrying both warning and reverence. "I needed air," she replied, her tone brittle. "Mother keeps the house too quiet." Josiah finally looked at her. His eyes held that same spark, steady, knowing, forbidden. "The quiet's safer, Ma'am." For a moment the storm seemed to hold its breath around them. Raindrops began to fall, slow at first, then in sheets. Caroline flinched as the wind whipped through the stable doors. Without thinking, Josiah stepped closer, pulling the door shut behind her. They stood there, inches apart, the air alive with thunder and something even more dangerous desire, unspoken but undeniable. "You'll catch cold," Josiah murmured, his voice almost breaking through the space between them. "And you'll be whipped if anyone sees us," she whispered back, heart racing. He smiled faintly. "Then we best not be seen." Lightning split the sky, and for an instant her face was illuminated, eyes wide, lips parted, trembling with fear and something deeper. Caroline felt every boundary she'd been taught begin to crumble. It wasn't love, not yet. It was defiance, raw and trembling, wrapped in longing. When the storm passed, she returned to the mansion in silence, her heart thundering louder than the rain that dripped from her hair. Upstairs, she stripped off her soaked gown, staring into the mirror. Her reflection looked foreign, eyes burning, skin flushed, her composure fractured. She pressed her palm against the glass and whispered to herself, "You're losing your mind." But as night fell and candles flickered in the hallways, Caroline could still hear the echo of his voice in the storm. Down in the slave quarters, Josiah sat on the edge of his cot, rain still glistening on his skin. He had not meant to look at her that way. He knew what such moments could cost a man could hang for less, yet he also knew the truth his heart refused to deny. Something had changed, and though neither of them would speak it aloud, fate had already written the first line of their shared ruin. As the crickets sang and the fields steamed from the rain, The mansion of Ashwood seemed to exhale in secret relief, unaware that within its whitewashed walls a forbidden story had already begun to breathe. The next morning dawned with a deceptive calm. The fields glistened under sunlight that seemed too bright, too pure for what lingered in the hearts of those who worked them. Caroline stood by her window, brushing out her golden hair, but her reflection no longer looked untouched. Sleep had refused her, replaced by images of the storm, the sound of rain on wood, Josiah's nearness, the weight of everything unsaid. She tried to banish the thought, whispering prayers as her mother's voice carried down the corridor, commanding servants and scolding maids. But beneath her whispered, Amen. Her heart beat with a different kind of truth, one that frightened her. Breakfast was a formal ritual at Ashwood. The dining room glowed with crystal and china, portraits of stern ancestors watching over every meal. Mrs. Waverley sat at the head, her lace collar tight as her posture. Caroline, she said, slicing her biscuit with deliberate grace, I've received word that Mr. Edmund Harlan will be arriving from Richmond tomorrow. His father wishes an introduction. You know how important this meeting is. Caroline forced a smile. Yes, mother. Mr. Harlan was heir to a shipping empire and one of Virginia's most eligible bachelors. His courtship could secure the Waverley name for another generation, but Caroline felt only dread. Marriage to a man she did not love would feel like another chain, one invisible, yet heavier than iron. After breakfast, she escaped to the gardens, her gown sweeping across dew-damp grass. The magnolias had just begun to bloom, their perfume thick and sweet. She found herself near the edge of the orchard, where the path turned toward the slave quarters. A voice within warned her to turn back, yet her feet kept moving. Down among the cabins, the day had already begun with the crack of Hollis's whip. Josiah stood beside the well, filling buckets while the overseer barked orders. Hollis's gaze flicked to Caroline's distant figure, his mouth curling with suspicion. He had noticed the way she looked at Josiah before, the hesitation in her tone when she gave him commands. He didn't like it. The mistress's curiosity, he thought, was a danger that could unravel the delicate order of the estate. When Caroline drew near, Hollis doffed his hat, his smile venomous. Mornin', Miss Waverley. Fine day, ain't it, after all that rain? She nodded stiffly. I wish to inspect the garden wall, Mr. Hollis. Continue your duties. Yes, ma'am. His tone dripped false respect. As soon as she turned away, he spat on the ground, muttering to himself. Caroline approached Josiah, pretending to admire the new fence posts. You've done fine work, she said softly, her heart pounding. He didn't look up. Thank you, miss. She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't betray her longing. Did the storm harm any of the crops? No, ma'am. The soil's thirsty this time of year. The rain helps. His hands were steady, but his jaw tightened. Every word carried risk. Caroline wanted to ask if he had thought of her, if the memory of last night haunted him too. But before she could speak again, a shout cut through the air. One of the field hands had collapsed under the sundae. The moment shattered. Hollis stormed past them, whip in hand, and Josiah's shoulders stiffened. Caroline turned away, hiding the tremor in her breath. That afternoon, she retreated to her study, a small room lined with books her father once loved. There, she wrote in her journal pages filled with reflections no one would ever read. There is something monstrous about feeling alive in a world built on another's suffering. If I am to inherit this place, then I inherit its sins as well. Her quill trembled. She shut the journal and hid it beneath the desk. Down in the quarters, Josiah's thoughts mirrored hers in a way neither could know. After the day's work, he sat outside his cabin, sharpening a blade that was older than memory. Old Ruth, the eldest woman among them, watched him quietly. You got something on your mind, boy, she said, her voice rough as gravel. Josiah gave a small smile. Ain't it always so? She narrowed her eyes. Be careful. That white girl look at you too long. Trouble come from eyes before it come from hands. He nodded, not denying it. I know. But when the moon rose, painting the fields silver, he found himself walking toward the orchard again. The night smelled of jasmine and rain-wet leaves. He stopped beneath the branches, unsure what had drawn him, until a light flickered at the edge of the trees. Caroline, cloaked in white, carrying a lantern, was walking the path alone. Miss, he whispered. She started, nearly dropping the lantern. You frightened me. I shouldn't be here, he said. Nor I. Her voice trembled, but I couldn't sleep. I thought I might breathe easier out here. The silence between them was louder than the cicadas. The lantern light danced across their faces, softening the boundaries of race and rank. Tell me something, she said. If you were free, what would you do? He hesitated, then looked past her into the darkness. I'd find a place where no one owned another. I'd work my own land. I'd wake up without fear. Her throat tightened. That sounds like heaven. He met her gaze. To some it is. A gust of wind nearly blew out the lantern. Caroline stepped closer, shielding the flame, their hands brushing for the first time. It was the smallest touch, but it carried the weight of centuries. In that touch was a confession neither dared to speak. "I should go," he said. "Yes," she whispered, but her feet did not move. The lantern flickered once more, casting their shadows against the orchard wall, two figures, bound by fate, standing where neither belonged. As Caroline returned to the house, her pulse still racing, she knew that something irreversible had begun. Josiah watched her disappear into the night, every instinct screaming to turn away from this path, but his heart strong as it was no longer obeyed reason. At dawn, the world of Ashwood would resume its order, the mistress in her lace, the slave in his chains. But between them now lay a silence thicker than blood, heavy with longing and doom. And though neither could name it, yet that silence would soon give birth to a secret that no storm could wash away. The next day brought noise and ceremony to Ashwood. By noon, the long-awaited guest arrived, Mr. Edmund Harlan, heir to the Harlan shipping fortune, his carriage gleaming under the sun, wheels crunching on the gravel drive. The servants lined up in silent ranks, heads bowed, while Mrs. Waverley fluttered about the veranda like a queen preparing for coronation. Caroline stood beside her mother, posture perfect, heart hollow. Edmund stepped down, removing his hat with a practiced smile. He was tall, well-groomed, with a voice trained for drawing rooms and politics. "Miss Waverley," he said, bowing slightly, "I have long heard of Ashwood's beauty, but I see now the tales spoke modestly." Caroline offered a polite curtsy. "You are kind, Mr. Harlan. Welcome." Their exchange pleased her mother greatly. The air thickened with the scent of approval, of futures arranged by wealth and lineage. As the two families dined that evening, Mrs. Waverley glowed with triumph. The table glittered with silver, candles, and polite conversation, an orchestra of manners. But beneath that harmony, Caroline's mind drifted elsewhere to the orchard, to a shadowed figure with eyes that saw her differently. While Edmund discussed trade routes and the governor's policies, she found herself studying the hands that poured his wine, the silent grace of Josiah, who served at her mother's command tonight. He moved with careful precision, invisible and unacknowledged, yet Caroline felt his every step like the ticking of a clock inside her chest. Once, their eyes met only for a heartbeat, but it was enough to fill the room with danger. She lowered her gaze quickly, but not quickly enough for Hollis, who stood watch from the corner, suspicion burning in his eyes. After supper, Mrs. Waverley led their guest to the parlour. The piano gleamed beneath candlelight, and Caroline was asked to play. She sat before the keys, fingers trembling until the melody began a soft waltz her father had loved. As she played, the rhythm carried her back to simpler days, before inheritance and expectation. The notes fluttered through the room like birds, elegant and mournful. Edmund clapped politely when she finished. "You play beautifully," he said. "My mother would adore such refinement." Caroline smiled faintly. "It was my father's favourite." "Ah, the late Mr. Waverley," Edmund replied, with the tone of one admiring a portrait, not a man. "He left behind quite an empire. You must be proud." She nodded, though pride was not what she felt. When the evening ended, she retreated to her chamber, the perfume of roses and candle smoke lingering in her hair. Edmund's compliments echoed in her mind, empty and measured, while one forbidden memory refused to fade the way Josiah had looked at her when no one else dared to. Outside, Hollis walked the grounds, lantern swinging. He stopped near the slave quarters, eyes narrowed. "I seen the way you look at her," he muttered under his breath, though Josiah wasn't there to hear it. "Think you special, don't you? We'll see about that." The next morning, Caroline was summoned to ride with Edmund. "A tour of your father's lands," he said pleasantly, helping her onto the carriage. They rolled past the endless rows of tobacco, where men and women bent under the sun, their movements a rhythm of exhaustion. Edmund watched with distant fascination. "Remarkable efficiency," he said. "Your overseer runs a fine operation." Caroline's stomach twisted. "Efficiency," she repeated softly. "You make it sound like machinery." He laughed. "In some sense it is. Order, discipline, those are the engines of prosperity. I'm sure your father would agree." She turned away, unable to hide her discomfort. The carriage stopped near the barns, where Josiah was mending a wagon wheel. Sweat gleamed on his skin, his shirt clinging to his frame. Edmund barely noticed him. Caroline noticed everything. Edmund stepped down, inspecting the horses. Fine stock, he said. I may send for one of your breeders. Josiah kept his head low, but his eyes flicked up, briefly meeting Caroline's before darting away. She felt that silent exchange like a secret note slipped between them. When the tour ended, Edmund returned to the manor to speak with Mrs. Waverley about family prospects. Caroline lingered by the orchard path again, pretending to gather flowers. She waited until the shadows lengthened, until she saw him, Josiah, approaching quietly. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, echoing his own warning from before. "And yet you came," she replied softly. He hesitated. "I heard Hollis talking. He's watching us." "I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "But I can't seem to stop." Neither could he. The air between them pulsed with unspoken hunger. She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. His palm was rough, calloused from labor, but when his fingers closed around hers, she felt safety in the danger. "You don't belong in my world," Josiah said, voice breaking. "Then let me belong in yours," she whispered. He shook his head. "You don't know what you're saying. They'd destroy us both." Her eyes filled with tears. "Perhaps we're already destroyed." Thunder rumbled in the distance again, as though the heavens themselves warned them. Caroline leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat. He held her only for a breath, then pulled away, fear clawing at him. "Go," he said, "before someone sees." She obeyed, running back through the orchard, skirts brushing the grass. When she looked back, he was gone. That night, she dreamed of the same heartbeat echoing beneath the sound of chains. Days passed. Edmund extended his visit, and with each polite conversation, Caroline's soul withered a little more. Hollis's scrutiny deepened. He began assigning Josiah harsher work, inventing reasons to punish him. Josiah endured it all in silence, but his eyes grew darker, haunted not by pain but by restraint. Caroline noticed every bruise. She began leaving small gestures, an extra loaf of bread in the kitchen, a folded cloth left by the stable. Acts of care disguised as chance. Yet even these were dangerous, for Hollis's malice was growing. One afternoon, Caroline overheard her mother speaking with Edmund in the parlor. "A marriage before summer would be most suitable," Mrs. Waverley said. "Ashwood needs a man's guidance again." Edmund smiled. "It would be my honor." Caroline froze outside the door, blood pounding in her ears. A cage was closing around her, one gilded with politeness and property, and somewhere beyond those walls, the only person who had ever looked at her without expectation was being slowly broken. That night, when all had gone to sleep, Caroline lit her lantern once more and slipped from her room. She didn't know what she would say, only that she needed to see him, needed to remind herself that she was still alive. The orchard waited, silent and dark, and in the hush before midnight, the mistress of Ashwood crossed the threshold from obedience into sin. The moon hung heavy over Ashwood, casting silver over the fields that stretched like an ocean of quiet misery. Caroline moved through the darkness with her lantern low, her heartbeat so loud it seemed to echo against the trees. The orchard loomed ahead, rows of black silhouettes shivering in the wind. Her slippers were soaked from the dew, her white nightgown clinging to her legs. She had not thought beyond this moment. All she knew was that she could not stay locked behind her mother's rules any longer. Josiah was already there. He had been drawn by something he could not explain, an ache, a pull stronger than reason. When he saw the faint glow of her lantern between the trees, he froze. The air felt charged, alive with both temptation and dread. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered as she reached him. "And yet here we both are," she answered, her voice trembling. The night carried the smell of earth and ripe apples, the hum of cicadas blending with their uneven breaths. Caroline's lantern cast a warm pool of light that barely reached their faces. She could see the fear in his eyes, and beneath it, something deeper, something that mirrored her own longing. "Do you think me wicked?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No, miss. I think you're lost." "Then we're the same," she said. The words hung between them like a confession. She reached out, fingertips brushing the rough fabric of his sleeve. It was the smallest touch, but it broke the wall between mistress and slave, propriety and hunger. Josiah flinched, not from disgust, but from the enormity of what that touch meant. "If anyone sees us—" "They won't," she cut in. "No one comes here after dark." He looked at her, his jaw tight. "There's no after to this, Caroline. Not for me. Not for you." She swallowed hard at the sound of her name on his lips. "Then let there be now." Lightning flickered far away, low thunder grumbling over the hills. The orchard was wrapped in that strange half-light where sin feels sanctified by silence. Caroline stepped closer, close enough to smell the warmth of his skin. to feel his breath against her cheek. When he didn't move away, she lifted her hand to his face. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered. "You should be," he said. His voice trembled, not from anger, but from everything he'd fought to keep buried. "I ain't the danger, the world is." But the world had already disappeared. The night became a cocoon around them, fragile, forbidden, infinite. Josiah's hand rose slowly, hesitantly, until it rested at the back of her neck. For a long moment they stood there, suspended between ruin and salvation. Then, as if drawn by a force beyond their will, their lips met. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, raw, a collision of everything denied to them. Her lantern slipped from her hand, landing softly in the grass, its light flickering against the curve of his jaw. She clung to him as though the world itself might crumble, and perhaps it did, in its own quiet way. When they finally broke apart, Caroline's breath came in shudders. "I don't care what they'd say," she whispered. Josiah's eyes burned with anguish. "You should, because I'll pay the price first." "You think I'd let them?" "You can't stop them," he said, stepping back, fists clenched. "Your name won't save me. It'll damn me faster." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his outline. "Then let me bear some of it." He shook his head slowly, looking at her as if memorizing a dream. "You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking." The wind picked up, rustling the trees like whispering ghosts. Caroline stepped forward again, her hand resting against his chest. The thrum of his heart beneath her palm was steady, powerful, alive. It anchored her to something real, something human, in a world built on pretense. He lowered his head, lips brushing her temple. "If we do this," he said quietly, "there ain't no turning back. Then we don't turn back." The orchard bore witness to what followed the trembling union of two souls who had no right to belong to each other, yet did. The world outside that grove would call it sin, call it madness. But to them, in that fleeting hour, it was neither. It was the only truth left. When the night began to pale, they lay in silence, listening to the distant cry of a whippoorwill. Caroline's hand rested in his, fingers entwined. She wanted to freeze time, to stay hidden in that fragile peace. But dawn, merciless as it always was, began to break. Josiah rose first, pulling on his shirt. His movements were quick, practical, already shadowed with fear. Caroline sat up, watching him. "Where will you go?" "Back to the fields," he said. "Same as always." Her heart twisted. "And me?" "You'll pretend none of this happened." She shook her head. "I can't." "You must." When he turned to leave, she reached out and caught his hand. "Josiah, if there's punishment, I'll take it." He smiled bitterly. "They won't let you." She wanted to answer, but footsteps echoed faintly from the direction of the house. Someone was coming. Panic surged through them both. Josiah vanished into the shadows of the orchard while Caroline snatched up her lantern and hurried back across the grass, heart pounding in her throat. By the time she reached the veranda, the first rays of morning were spreading across the sky. A maid stood there, startled by her appearance. "Miss Caroline? You been out walking?" Caroline forced a smile. "I couldn't sleep. Needed air." The maid curtsied and said nothing more, but her eyes held curiosity that would soon turn to gossip. Inside, Caroline locked her chamber door and collapsed onto her bed. Her body still trembled with what had happened, with what she had done. Shame warred with wonder. She knew there was no undoing it now. Something irreversible had been written into her blood. From that day forward, every glance, every breath, became an act of concealment. When she passed Josiah in the yard, they no longer looked at each other. But silence had its own language, and theirs spoke louder than words. Hollis began watching her more closely, lurking near the stables whenever she lingered too long. He could feel the change like the scent of smoke before a fire. One wrong step, one misplaced word, and the secret would ignite. For weeks, Caroline moved through her days as if walking a tightrope. She attended dinners, smiled through courtship, endured her mother's chatter about wedding dates. But every night, when she closed her eyes, she saw the orchard, the glint of moonlight on Josiah's skin, the truth she could never confess. And one morning, as she rose and touched her stomach absently, she realized that her secret had begun to grow not just in memory, but in flesh. The days after Elijah's imprisonment felt like a long funeral for the living. The once bustling halls of Ravenhurst Manor had grown hushed, as if every painting, every piece of furniture, mourned the collapse of its mistress's world. Clara Belle Davenport, the heiress once hailed as the jewel of Virginia, moved through her ancestral corridors like a pale wraith. Her eyes, swollen and ringed with sleepless nights, no longer looked upon her estate with pride, but with the haunted dread of one who'd sown her own ruin. Outside, the magnolia trees bloomed with cruel beauty. Their fragrance, once her comfort, now turned her stomach. Every blossom reminded her of the hidden place behind the old barn, the same place where Elijah's arms had once held her trembling form, whispering love into her neck, calling her by name, not title. That forbidden intimacy now echoed in her mind with unbearable clarity. Inside the slave quarters, hushed gossip spread like wildfire. The whispers told of how the white mistress had fallen for her own slave, and that she now carried his child. Some whispered with pity, others with grim satisfaction, a reversal of all the centuries of power that had weighed on their shoulders. Among them, old Nana Ruth shook her head and said, "The Lord done flipped the script this time. The mighty house of Davenport, about to learn what it means to bleed like the rest of us." But Clara's suffering had only begun. The doctor, summoned discreetly from Richmond, confirmed what she already feared. "Miss Davenport," he said in a whisper meant for her ears alone, "the child grows strong, but if this news were to reach your kin, the scandal would be ruinous. I must what?" She cut him off, voice trembling. "Destroy my own blood?" The doctor faltered, his gaze shifting to the floor. "You know as well as I what they will do if they find out whose seed it is." That night, Clara stood before her mirror, candlelight trembling across her tear-streaked face. Her reflection looked nothing like the woman she had been, a society belle, a daughter of legacy. Instead, she saw a stranger, someone marked by sin, courage, and defiance. Her hand fell to her belly, and with a broken whisper she vowed, "No matter what they do to me, I will not let them harm him." Meanwhile, Elijah languished in the dark of the Ravenhurst cellar, his wrists chained, his spirit flickering between hope and despair. The damp earth reeked of mildew and blood. He replayed Clara's screams from that night when they'd torn him away from her, and each echo fed the fire in his chest. He knew what the overseer had said, that he would be sold to the deep south, where men disappeared and never returned. But Elijah had sworn to himself long ago no man would decide his fate again. He whispered her name to the darkness, as if the sound alone could keep her alive. Clara. Unbeknownst to them, Jonathan Reed, the overseer, had begun to leverage his discovery. He had seen Clara's secret, had caught the look of desperation in her eyes when Elijah was taken. He knew the power of scandal and the value of silence. He began visiting the manor more often under the pretense of delivering inventory reports, his gaze crawling over Clara with serpentine calculation. "You needn't worry, Miss Davenport," he said one evening, cornering her by the staircase. "A man who keeps secrets expects to be compensated." Clara's hand tightened on the banister. "You're filth," she hissed. He smirked, tipping his hat. "Maybe, but I'm filth who knows the truth. And truth is a dangerous thing for a lady like you." That night after Reed's departure, Clara found herself trembling not from fear but from rage. It was a feeling that pulsed through her like a second heartbeat. Her eyes drifted toward the key to the cellar, hidden behind the old portrait of her father. For days she wrestled with the thought until the cries from the fields reached her window. Elijah's cries, faint but unmistakable. That sound shattered the last of her restraint. Under the veil of midnight, she crept through the house with only a lantern in hand. The boards beneath her feet groaned like guilty accomplices. Every shadow felt alive, every flicker of light a threat. At last she reached the cellar. The key turned with a groan, and there he was, filthy, beaten, yet unbroken. His eyes met hers, disbelief melting into fierce tenderness. "Clara?" She dropped the lantern and ran to him, clutching his face in trembling hands. "I couldn't let them take you. I couldn't." He kissed her fingers, then her tears. "You came back for me. I will always come back," she breathed. "But we have little time. We must leave tonight." They escaped the cellar, cloaked in moonlight and desperation. Clara led him through the hidden grove that bordered the Davenport estate, a path known only to her since childhood. The magnolias loomed overhead like silent witnesses, their white petals glowing in the dark like ghosts. Behind them, the manor stood tall and black against the horizon, a monument to their curse. When they reached the edge of the forest, Elijah paused. "If we go, there's no return," he warned softly. She turned to him, her face streaked with dirt and resolve. "Then let Virginia burn behind us." Yet even as she said it, distant cry broke through the night. Someone had seen them. Torches began to bloom near the manor, shouts rising like the growl of an approaching storm. Their only chance now was to vanish before the mob reached the grove. Elijah gripped her hand, pulling her into the depths of the forest. The scent of magnolia faded behind them, swallowed by the wild and the dark, and somewhere between the rustle of leaves and the drum of their hearts, both knew. They were no longer mistress and slave, but fugitives bound by love and a secret child that would change the bloodline of Virginia forever. The night they fled Ravenhurst, the Virginia sky turned an ominous grey, heavy with the promise of storm. Clara clutched the hem of her torn gown as she ran beside Elijah, her bare feet sinking into the mud with every desperate step. The forest swallowed them whole, its shadows deep as the sea, its silence broken only by the rasp of their breath and the distant barking of hounds. Behind them, the world of masters and heirs began to burn. The overseer, Jonathan Reed, realizing his prize had slipped away, roused the men with torches and rifles. His voice echoed through the night like a curse. "Find them both. The mistress and that damn slave, bring 'em back alive if you can, but don't let 'em cross the river." The tidewater region stretched before them, a labyrinth of swamp, creek, and open field. For all its beauty, it was treacherous land for fugitives. Clara had only seen this wilderness through carriage windows, never on foot, never like this, mud clinging to her skirts, hair soaked with rain, her heartbeat wild and primal. Yet through the fear there was a strange freedom too. For the first time in her life there were no walls around her, no watchful eyes of society, no hollow laughter at gilded parlors. There was only Elijah beside her, real, breathing, alive. He guided her through the underbrush, whispering directions learned from years of secret, listening paths slaves whispered about, routes that ran through the backs of plantations and into the unknown. "We follow the creek," he murmured. "It'll carry us toward the Rappahannock River. There's folks near the crossing, free men, maybe even Quakers. They'll hide us if we make it that far." Clara nodded, her face pale but determined. "Then we make it that far." Hours blurred together under the storm. Thunder rolled across the hills like cannon fire. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, washing blood and dirt from Elijah's face, slicking Clara's golden hair to her skin. He caught her when she stumbled, lifting her over roots and stones with strength that seemed carved from the earth itself. She would have fallen 100 times, but he never let her go. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a mist. They reached the edge of a field, an expanse of tall grass waving gently under grey light. Elijah scanned the horizon. "The Davenport men won't be far," he said. "We need to rest in the woods before we cross open ground." They slipped beneath a fallen oak, hiding among its roots. Clara pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the faint stir within her. "He moves," she whispered. "Your son." Elijah's eyes softened. "Then we keep moving for him." He kissed her forehead, the gesture tender amid the cold and hunger. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the dripping woods, they allowed themselves to dream of what could be a cabin somewhere far from Virginia, where no one cared about bloodlines, where a child could grow free. Elijah spoke of building furniture with his own hands, of teaching the boy to read. Clara, half delirious with exhaustion, imagined hanging white curtains over wooden windows, the smell of bread baking, laughter without fear. But the world beyond the forest had other plans. By mid-morning they heard the sound of dogs again, closer this time. The overseer's men had tracked their trail through the mud. Reed rode at the front, his face twisted with triumph. "They can run," he growled to the men beside him, "but there's no hiding a white woman in these woods." Elijah heard them before Clara did. He motioned for her to stay low, then scouted ahead. Through the reeds, he spotted a small abandoned ferry shack by the river's bend. "There," he said when he returned, breathless. "We can cross from there. Once on the other side, they'll lose the dogs." They sprinted toward the river, hearts pounding. The water gleamed dark and swollen from the storm. The ferry ropes were frayed, the raft half sunken. Still, Elijah began cutting it loose, muscles straining. "Get on," he told her. "I'll push us off." She hesitated. "No, together." "Clara, there's no time." Gunfire cracked behind them. Bullets tore through the reeds. Clara screamed as one whizzed past her head. Elijah shoved the raft free, leaping aboard as it lurched into the current. The river seized them, spinning the raft toward midstream. Behind them, Reed shouted from the bank, his pistol flashing again. "You can't outrun sin, boy!" he yelled. The raft bucked violently. Elijah grabbed the rope, pulling Clara close. "Hold on." Rain poured anew as the storm returned with fury. The river roared, tossing them like leaves. Clara clung to him, eyes wide with terror. "Elijah, if we die." "We won't," he swore, gripping her tighter. "Not here, not tonight." The current slammed them against a half-submerged tree. The raft splintered. Elijah caught Clara before she fell into the torrent, dragging her onto the far bank with desperate strength. They collapsed together in the mud, gasping, soaked to the bone but alive. For a long while, neither spoke. The forest on this side of the river was different, wilder, untouched. When Elijah finally stood, he looked back across the water. Reed and his men were still shouting on the opposite shore, their torches flickering futilely. "They won't cross in this weather," Elijah said. "We've got a few hours before they find another way around." Clara looked up at him, her savior, her forbidden love, and realized there was no turning back. She took his hand, trembling but resolute. "Then we run until the world can't find us." They pushed deeper into the wilderness. By twilight, they found shelter in the ruins of an old trading post, its roof half collapsed but dry enough to rest. Clara lay against Elijah's chest, exhausted. He traced circles on her back, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Outside, the rain faded, and the first stars appeared over the soaked fields of Virginia. Somewhere far behind them, the flames of Ravenhurst still smoldered, and in that dying light, two hunted souls held each other beneath the weight of a world determined to erase them, yet they endured, breathing, waiting, defying. For the first time, the heiress of Virginia and her slave were bound, not by law or lust, but by survival itself. Dawn crept over the forest like a wounded thing, pale and slow. Clara woke to the sound of dripping water, the faint cries of crows echoing through the mist. The remnants of the trading post around them smelled of damp wood and rusted iron. Elijah was already awake, standing at the doorway, watching the fog roll through the trees. His shirt was torn, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion. Yet in that dim light he looked carved from something unbreakable endurance given flesh. She stirred and tried to rise, but pain gripped her lower back. Elijah was at her side in an instant. "Easy," he said softly. "You need to rest." Her hand went to her belly, her breath caught. "The pains, they started last night." He froze. "Too soon," he whispered. "It's too soon." Clara was only 7 months gone, but her body, worn by flight and fear, was giving way. Elijah laid his cord beneath her, covering her with what little cloth they had left. Outside, thunder still muttered along the horizon. "We need help," he said, scanning the tree line. "There's got to be someone nearby." But who could they trust? Every farmhouse bore risk, each door a trap waiting to close. He kissed her brow. "I'll find someone, I swear it." Her hand caught his. "No. Don't leave me, Elijah, please." He hesitated. The tremor in her voice was worse than the storm itself. He sat beside her, wrapping his arms around her trembling body. "Then I'll stay. We face this together." The hours crawled. Clara's cries mingled with the wind, muffled against his chest. The agony came in waves, fierce and unrelenting. Elijah had seen men die under the lash, but nothing had prepared him for this kind of pain, the pain of creation, of a woman bearing life in the jaws of death. He prayed under his breath, words half remembered from the quarters. "Lord, if you ever listen to a slave, listen now." When the storm broke again, it came with lightning that split the sky. Rain poured through the gaps in the roof, hissing against the dying embers of their small fire. Clara screamed once, a sound that tore through the forest like the cry of something ancient and sacred. And then silence. A single, frail wail followed. Elijah's hands trembled as he held the child, his vision blurring with tears. The boy's skin was light, his hair dark and soft as night rain. Clara lay back, pale and shaking, her breath ragged but alive. "Elijah," she whispered weakly. "Our son." He placed the child against her chest. She smiled faintly, tracing a trembling finger along the baby's cheek. "He's beautiful." For a fleeting moment, there was peace, a fragile pocket of eternity carved from ruin. Outside, the forest hummed with life, the rain slowing to a whisper. But Elijah's eyes never left the doorway. He knew the world would not allow such peace to last. By afternoon, he left the ruin briefly to gather water from the stream. When he returned, Clara was asleep, the child wrapped in her arms. Yet something else waited with them. A figure stood in the doorway, Jonathan Reed, soaked to the bone, his pistol gleaming. "Took me long enough," Reed said with a sneer. "You led quite the chase, boy." His gaze slid to Clara and the child. "And this must be the fruit of your little sin." Elijah's heart stopped. "Don't you touch them?" Reed cocked the gun lazily. "Don't worry. I won't harm the lady. Not if she comes home quietly. But you," he aimed the barrel squarely at Elijah's chest, "you've run far enough." Clara woke with a start, her scream piercing the air. "Jonathan, please. He'll kill you if you do this. My brother will." "Your brother's gone," Reed spat. "He left the estate when the scandal broke. You've got no one now, Clara, except me." Elijah moved before Reed could react. He lunged, slamming into the overseer with raw fury. The pistol fired once, the shot echoing through the hollow ruin. Birds scattered from the trees. Both men fell hard, grappling in the mud. Reed was strong, but Elijah was driven by something primal, a father's wrath, a lover's vengeance, years of pain ignited into one burning purpose. Reed's hands closed around Elijah's throat. "You should have stayed in chains," he hissed. Elijah's vision dimmed, the edges blurring red. His hand groped blindly, finding a shard of broken wood. With the last of his strength, he drove it upward into Reed's neck. The overseer's eyes widened, a wet gasp escaping his lips before he fell limp. Clara screamed as blood pooled into the mud. Elijah staggered back, chest heaving, staring at the lifeless man who had haunted them since Ravenhurst. "It's done," he whispered hoarsely. "It's over." But even as the words left him, the weight of what he'd done sank deep. There would be no mercy now. The law would hunt them both for murder, for scandal, for daring to love beyond chains. He turned to Clara. She sat clutching their newborn, her eyes wide and full of tears. "Elijah, what do we do?" He knelt beside her, pressing his forehead to hers. "We go north. There's a settlement past the river, safe ground for runaways. They'll help us disappear." She looked down at the child, then back at him. "If they catch us." "They won't." His voice trembled, but his gaze burned with resolve. "Not while I'm breathing." They buried Reed's body near the roots of the magnolia tree that grew by the post, a symbol perhaps of every sin the South tried to hide beneath its soil. Clara whispered a prayer over the grave, her voice breaking with grief and exhaustion. The wind carried it away into the night. By dawn, they were gone again, leaving only muddy footprints and the faint cry of a newborn behind. For days they traveled through the wilderness, sleeping under fallen logs, drinking from streams, surviving on berries and hope. Elijah carried both Clara and the child when her strength failed. She would wake sometimes to find him watching her, his face weary but filled with something deeper than devotion, faith that they could still build a life from ashes. At last, after what felt like eternity, they reached a hill overlooking a small village nestled beside the river. Smoke rose from chimneys. Bells rang faintly in the distance. Clara wept silently, holding the baby close. "Elijah," she whispered, "we made it." He smiled, though tears streaked his face. "We ain't free yet," he said softly, "but we're close enough to taste it." Above them, the magnolia petals fell from unseen trees, caught by the wind and carried eastward toward Virginia, toward memory, toward a house that would never again bear the name of Davenport without shame. The small village of Brookhaven lay hid behind fields of golden rye and whispering pines. Smoke from its chimneys curled into a morning sky washed pale by frost. To the weary pair who approached from the woods, it looked almost like salvation. Elijah, gaunt from hunger and sleepless nights, carried the child in one arm while his other helped guide Clara, who limped with exhaustion. Her once ivory dress was now little more than rags, yet her head remained high, her eyes unbroken. They reached the edge of the village at dawn, where a modest chapel stood beside the road. A woman sweeping the steps, grey-haired, kind-faced, froze at the sight of them. Elijah stopped several feet away, unsure if this stranger would scream or summon others, but instead, the woman's gaze softened. "Mercy," she whispered. "You two look half dead. Come in, quick, before someone sees." Inside the chapel, warmth returned to their bones. The woman introduced herself as Martha Tolliver, the local midwife and healer. She asked no questions, only brought bread, broth, and a blanket for the child. When Clara at last spoke, her voice trembled. "Please, we mean no harm. We're just trying to start again." Martha smiled faintly. "Ain't my place to pry into God's work. The good Lord sends the lost ones where they need to be." Her eyes drifted toward the infant sleeping in Elijah's arms. "He's beautiful. Got your eyes, sir." Elijah blinked, surprised by her kindness. Few white folk ever looked at him without suspicion or scorn. Martha noticed his hesitation and added gently, "There are folks here who don't care what blood runs in your veins, long as you work honest and cause no trouble." For the next week, they stayed in a small cabin behind the chapel. Martha helped Clara recover, feeding her herbs and tea to strengthen her after the birth. Elijah worked quietly, chopping wood, repairing fences, offering his labor to earn their keep. To the villagers, they were simply travelers, a young couple with a newborn, drifting westward like many others after the war years. None asked questions they did not want answered. Still, at night, Clara's sleep was restless. She often dreamed of Ravenhurst Manor, of torches in the dark and the overseer's cold eyes. Some nights she woke in tears, clutching Elijah's arm. "He's gone," he'd whisper, soothing her. "Ain't no one left to hurt you now." But he was wrong. Far from Brookhaven, the flames of scandal still smoldered across Virginia. The Davenport estate, stripped of its fortune and heirs, had become a ghost of its former glory. Rumors spread through Richmond's parlors. The heiress had vanished with her slave. The child born of sin still lived somewhere in the wilds. To the powerful families who once toasted Clara's beauty, her name became a whisper, her memory a stain to be erased. One man, however, refused to let the story die: Colonel James Davenport, Clara's uncle and surviving patriarch of the family. When word of Reed's disappearance reached him, he hired bounty men to uncover the truth. "That girl carries our name," he snarled, "and she will not drag it through the mud of history. Bring her back dead or alive, I don't care." Weeks passed in uneasy peace before the past found them again. It was a bitter February evening when Elijah noticed strangers at the tavern, rough men with southern accents, their eyes sharp, their questions sharper. He overheard one say, "Word is they crossed the Rappahannock about a month ago. The woman had a babe with her, fair-haired, ain't hard to spot." Elijah's blood ran cold. He slipped from the tavern and ran through the snow to their cabin. Clara stood by the fire, rocking the baby. "Pack what you can," he said breathlessly. "They're here, Davenport's men." Her face drained of color. "How do they know?" "Doesn't matter. We can't stay." Martha arrived moments later, having seen the same strangers. Without hesitation, she handed Elijah a bundle of supplies. "Head north through the woods," she said urgently. "There's a family near the Shenandoah foothills, Quakers. They'll hide you. I'll tell the men you went west." Clara embraced her fiercely. "You saved us once, I can't—" "Hush, child," Martha whispered. "You owe me nothing. Go, before the sun rises." They fled once more under cover of darkness, the child cradled between them. Snow fell thick and silent, muffling their steps. The wind howled like ghosts chasing their heels. Clara stumbled often, her body still frail, but she pressed on. "I won't lose him," she murmured over and over. "Not now, not after everything." By dawn they reached the frozen edge of a wide plain. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, the promise of shelter. Elijah lifted Clara into his arms and trudged through the snow, each step an act of will. Behind them the faint echo of hooves grew louder. The bounty men had found their trail. A gunshot cracked the still air. Elijah flinched as the bullet grazed his shoulder. He fell, clutching the wound, but forced himself upright. "Run!" he shouted. "Clara, go!" She refused. "I won't leave you." The pursuers emerged from the trees, 3 men on horseback, rifles glinting in the pale light. The leader, a heavy-set man with a scar across his cheek, called out, "Give her up, boy. She's wanted for murder and madness. You've got no right to keep her." Elijah stepped in front of Clara, blood soaking through his shirt. "She's got every right to live free," he growled. "You want her, you go through me." The men laughed, their breath misting in the cold. "You ain't worth the bullet it'll take to drop you." The scarred one raised his gun, but before he could fire, Clara lifted the small Derringer pistol she'd taken from Reed's belt weeks ago. Her hands shook, but her eyes blazed. "Leave him," she said coldly. The men hesitated. The sight of the delicate heiress turned outlaw unsettled them. For a moment, no one moved. Then the scarred man spurred his horse forward. Clara fired. The shot hit his chest, throwing him from the saddle. The others wheeled back in shock. Elijah lunged forward, grabbing Clara's arm. "Run!" They tore through the snow toward the distant smoke, hearts pounding. The child wailed softly against Clara's breast. Behind them, the surviving pursuers regrouped, shouting threats. Hours later, when the sun broke through the clouds, they stumbled upon a small farmhouse. A bearded man and his wife, plain-dressed Quakers, stood at the doorway, startled by the sight of them. Elijah collapsed before he could speak. Clara fell beside him, gasping, "Please, help us. They'll kill him." The Quakers did not hesitate. They carried the wounded pair inside, barring the doors as distant hoofbeats faded into the hills. As night fell over the Shenandoah Valley, Clara knelt beside Elijah's bed, clutching his hand. His eyes fluttered open weakly. "Still, together," he whispered. "Always," she said, pressing her lips to his knuckles. Outside, snow covered their tracks. Ravenhurst Manor lay hundreds of miles behind them, its halls empty, its fields overgrown. The once golden heiress who had carried the child of her slave now knelt in a stranger's cabin, praying not for status or salvation, but for the man who had given her both love and freedom at the cost of everything. The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming against the worn roof of the abandoned chapel where Clara had taken her final refuge. The years had not been kind to her. Her golden hair, once envied by every debutante in Virginia, had dulled to the color of tarnished straw. Her once soft hands were lined and calloused, her gowns replaced by rough fabric, sewn by trembling fingers. Yet beneath the frailty of her frame, there remained a quiet fire, the same stubborn defiance that had once led her to defy the world for love. On the floor beside her lay a boy, no longer a babe, but a child of about 7, dark-skinned with her eyes and Elijah's jawline. He slept peacefully beneath a threadbare quilt, unaware of the forces that hunted them still. Clara brushed a lock of his hair back tenderly. "You must never know shame for who you are," she whispered. "You are both the curse and the redemption of our name." Outside, a wagon creaked to a halt. The sound froze her blood. Through the cracked window, she saw torchlight flicker, not the light of travelers, but of pursuers. Jonathan Reed, older now, stood in the storm with his men, his face half lit by the flame. His voice rang out, cold and triumphant. "She's here! Bring her out!" The door shuddered under the weight of boots and fists. Clara stood tall, clutching her son to her chest. The years of fear hardened into resolve. She kissed the boy's forehead once. "Hide, my heart," she murmured, pushing him into the small crawl space beneath the altar. "No matter what you hear, stay silent. Stay alive." The doors burst open. Reed stepped inside, dripping rain and arrogance. "I warned you, Clara. You should have begged when I offered mercy." She faced him, unflinching. "You have no mercy left to give." He chuckled. "You've ruined yourself for a man who was never your equal. For that, your name will rot in the dirt with him." Clara's gaze was steady. "Then let it rot. The truth will outlive us all." Reed gestured sharply. 2 men seized her arms. Her resistance was futile, yet her dignity never faltered. They dragged her outside, where the rain mingled with the mud. Reed held up a worn piece of parchment, an arrest warrant, signed by her own cousin, Henry Davenport, who had inherited the family estate after declaring her mentally unfit. "By the authority of Virginia," Reed said, mockingly, "you are charged with harboring a fugitive and bearing his bastard child. Your line ends here." The child beneath the altar pressed his tiny hand over his mouth, his eyes wide and wet with terror. Through the slats, he watched as they bound his mother's hands. Clara met Reed's gaze one last time. "Do what you must," she said softly. "But know this, I carried love where none should grow, and that love will haunt your name long after the worms have your bones." Reed sneered. "You think your sin can live beyond you?" Clara's lips curved faintly, almost smiling. "It already does." He struck her. The blow sent her to her knees, the mud splashing up around her torn skirts. Lightning split the sky above them, and for an instant, the storm illuminated the old magnolia tree beside the chapel, its blossoms white against the blackness, a ghostly bloom of defiance. Reed lifted his pistol. The crack of thunder drowned the gunshot. When the smoke cleared, Clara lay still in the mud, her body limp, her face turned toward the heavens. Her blood mingled with the rain, running in rivulets that carved crimson paths through the earth. Reed wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, muttering, "Bury her deep. No marker." His men obeyed, shoveling the soaked earth until the ground swallowed her. None noticed the faint trail of small footprints leading away from the chapel, footprints washed clean by the storm before dawn. 20 years later, Virginia had changed. The Civil War had burned through its fields, and the old names Davenport, Reed, Carter had either fallen or fled. The manor of Ravenhurst stood in ruins, its white pillars blackened by fire, its portraits reduced to ashes. In the shadow of those ashes walked a young man, tall, proud, skin the shade of sun-burnished bronze. He bore the carriage of both worlds, neither wholly white nor wholly black. His name was Isaac Bell, though the locals whispered he was the Davenport ghost. He had returned not for inheritance but for truth. Through the cracked remains of the estate, he found the remnants of the chapel and the magnolia tree that still bloomed defiantly beside it. Beneath it lay an unmarked grave, his mother's. He knelt, the wind catching his coat, and whispered, "I came back, Mama." From his satchel, he drew a locket, the same one Clara had worn around her neck, engraved with the intertwined initials CD and EH. Inside was a lock of her faded hair and a scrap of parchment bearing a verse written in her hand. "Love that breaks chains will one day mend them." He pressed the locket to his heart, eyes stinging. "They thought they could erase you," he murmured, "but they only planted you deeper." Behind him a voice spoke, gentle, feminine, trembling with recognition. "You're her son, aren't you?" Isaac turned. A young woman stood in the doorway of the ruined chapel, pale-skinned, with the bearing of gentry, but eyes softened by guilt. She introduced herself as Margaret Reed, the overseer's daughter. My father told me stories, lies, I think, about the woman he killed. I had to see for myself. Isaac's voice was calm but edged with iron. Then look upon her grave and know what your blood did. Tears filled her eyes. If I could undo it, I would. He studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, You can't undo it, but you can remember. Together they planted a single white magnolia atop the grave. As the petals trembled in the wind, Isaac turned his face to the horizon, the first light of morning breaking over the fields once soaked in blood. And in that fragile dawn, a strange peace settled. The child of love and rebellion stood where both chains and names had been broken. The world that had condemned his mother was gone, but her story remained, whispered in the rustle of magnolia leaves, and the song of freedom carried on the wind. Some said that when the flowers bloomed each spring, a woman's shadow could still be seen among them, head held high, eyes alight with defiance, the heiress of Virginia, whose love defied her lineage and changed it forever.